How's it going, everybody? Thank you for checking out my video. And today we're going to be explaining the Marvel MCU timeline from Iron Man all the way to Loki. And we are going to show you why Endgame wasn't real. It never happened. And possibly nothing after Avengers 2012 happened as well. Before we begin, there are going to be timestamps down in the description below. So that way, if you guys want to jump around to the parts that just interest you most, please use them as you need to. And there's going to be one timestamp that I cannot stress enough. If you are not an adult, it will be labeled, do not proceed further watching it. And I'm not saying this as reverse psychology for you to be more interested in, ooh, what's that in there? It is not meant for kids to understand. It is meant for adults. When you think outside the box and you really understand how things go, you'll get it. Kids won't. So I really strongly advise that the kids do not watch it. Again, not reverse psychology, it is just the truth. When you watch that part of the video, you will better understand. Before we begin, I want to have a grounded idea as to what the sacred timeline, prime timeline within the sacred timeline, as well as how time travel works within the MCU. Because just like with the rest of the MCU, we're going to be going all over the place. And we want to make sure to have a good, agreeable place to be able to start, so that way it doesn't get too confusing for you guys. As well as the information that I'm going to be providing in this video is all something that you can find within the MCU movies or shows. Also, I'm only going to be talking about things that come from the MCU. That means I'm not going to be going over any of the comic books as far as being able to get information, because I personally believe that when it comes to, for example, the MCU, you should not have to go to different sources to be able to better understand something that is being shown on screen. So for example, I don't feel that it is right to watch a movie and then to have to go read a comic book to be able to better understand it. You can, but I don't think that it should be necessary, because if it's something that is introduced in the MCU, it should be explained in the MCU. Just like I don't feel that it is necessary to watch the movie, then have to go watch the show, then go watch the movie to be able to better understand what's coming forward, especially with the idea that you should not have to watch post-credit scenes to be able to better understand source material or to get source material for the next event coming up. I feel that if something is introduced in one particular medium, that it should be consistent within that medium to be able to better understand what is coming. You should not have to go to other mediums to be able to understand the one that you originally got it from. Now, I know that when it comes to the actual timeline of the MCU from Iron Man all the way to Endgame, a lot of people may be confused on how that works. And a lot of people think that it looks like this. When if you actually break it down, and I will in this video, it looks like this. Looks a little bit confusing, doesn't it? Well, when doing my research and drawing it out for myself, this is the only way that it actually makes sense. And by the end of the video, hopefully it'll make sense for you as well. So getting started, first thing, let's go ahead and talk about what the sacred timeline is and how it differs from the prime timeline. It is understood to be the timeline of all universes to be played out 100% as written, from the beginning of time to the end of time, with no deviations, meaning everything that happens within the sacred timeline was supposed to happen for a specific reason, and was known and written by the one who remains, or King the Conqueror. Within a universe is a prime timeline, where the same rules apply as the sacred timeline. There is one timeline for every universe, and as explained in episode 6, there are countless universes, all parallel to the one we have been watching throughout the MCU, all of which have their own planned outcomes that possibly could not differ from what we know to be accurate with our prime timeline, or could be drastically different from our own. This is easier seen than explained, as when Loki was pruned and ended up seeing different versions of himself in the void at the end of time. Each one of the Lokis you see comes from a different universe, as Loki starts to understand in episode 1 that the TVA exists outside of space and time. Thus, what happens in the TVA and in the void, having different versions of variants together where they are, doesn't upset the sacred timeline, and also why Kid Loki killed Thor in his prime timeline, and our Loki was shocked upon hearing this. Think of them as duplicates. As Ebony Maw tells Thanos about another nebula in his timeline, when the Avengers take the Power Stone at Endgame, or even additions, once the sacred timeline is reset. So a variant die-in would do nothing for the timeline they come from, just as the Infinity Stones have no power outside of the universe they are taken from, as having two of the same stone within one sacred timeline would upset the power balance of the other Infinity Stones in the prime timeline. Now let's look at how the Hulk describes time travel in Endgame when it comes to the MCU. If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future, and your former present becomes your past, which now can't be changed by your new future. To be able to sum that up for those that may be confused, just like I was when I first heard it, you cannot change the events in the past. When you go back into the past, changing anything does not change the future from where you came from. It creates an alternate timeline where you continue on. This means that to stay on the prime timeline, you would have to change nothing of the past. Otherwise, you would create what's called the butterfly effect, meaning that if you were to change anything in the past, no matter how minor, it could cause drastic changes for your future. Now that we have some common ground as far as how the sacred timeline, prime timeline, and time travel works within the MCU, all explained within the MCU itself, let's talk about how our prime timeline within the sacred timeline never actually continued on into Endgame, that it ended right after Infinity War when the Avengers were going back in time to get the Infinity Stones, that when they came to the future in 2023, everything that proceeded afterwards were all variants of the real prime timeline. Looking at the scenes in Endgame when the Avengers were testing out time travel using Ant-Man, yes, that actually did happen, as his job was to just travel back without changing anything of the past, proving that time travel was actually possible. However, it was when the Avengers were sent back in time to get the Infinity Stones where the actual prime timeline within the sacred timeline had stopped, to never be shown again. This is because of what the Hulk said, that going into the past creates a brand new future timeline. But this is only where the confusion really starts. The Ancient One talked with Banner in Endgame, explaining that taking the stones from one timeline may help his own, but dooms hers as she is from the prime timeline. Once the Avengers came back to the future with all the Infinity Stones, that is actually a completely different prime timeline from the one that they actually left in. One that shouldn't have even existed at all. Let's look at where they took the stones from in the past. The Space Stone taken from the 70s. Originally they were supposed to get it in New York City in 2012 during The Avengers, but as shown in the opening scene of Loki, Loki makes off with it. Tony eventually gets it in Pym's lab in New Jersey, where he runs into his father before returning to the future. The Power Stone in 2014. Nebula and War Machine take it before Peter Quill has a chance to steal it. War Machine takes it back, but Nebula becomes captured. The Reality Stone from Asgard in 2013, when Rocket takes it out of Jane Foster, and Thor and Rocket take it back to the future. The Mind Stone from New York in 2012, when Captain America obtains it from undercover Hydra agents, and Ant-Man takes it back to the future. The Soul Stone from Vormir in 2014, when Black Widow sacrifices herself for Hawkeye to obtain it, then travels back to the future. And the Time Stone from New York in 2012, when Dr. Banner is given it from the Ancient One after she helps him understand the consequences of taking a stone from the prime timeline. The future that they come back to is in 2023. But when you think of the details as far as the things that they had to do in the past to get to the future, that timeline doesn't actually exist as it does. Most would then question the conversation between Dr. Banner and the Ancient One, that as long as the Infinity Stones are given back at the exact moment that they were taken from, that things should be okay. However, because they all go into the future of 2023 with all of the Infinity Stones of the past, then the events that happened preceding the loss of the stones in the past never occurred for the present future they are in. Remember that the stones are only maybe missing for less than a second in the past. However, when they all have the stones in the future, that future's past, while they have the stones, has no stones in the times that they were needed for the present future to occur. Doctor Strange was never able to defeat Dormammu, let alone bring everyone into the final Endgame fight. Ultron was never created, meaning the Winter Soldier was never framed for King T'Challa's death, as well as Wanda and Quicksilver were never able to see that the Avengers, especially Tony, were actually good, which means that Civil War wouldn't have occurred. Black Widow would have been alive, Captain Marvel never got her powers, nobody would have been snapped out of existence. Even thinking about the exact moments the stones were taken, the consequences of that stone being missing would lead to consequences from which the next stone could be taken in the actual prime timeline, still proving the events that happened right after coming back to the future with all 6 Infinity Stones never occurred. That means that Spider-Man Far From Home, WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and the continuation of Marvel from this point forward would not exist as canon. Also, when Captain America goes back to return the Infinity Stones and ends up staying with Peggy Carter to live out his life, he would not have been able to meet up with the Avengers when he sits on the bench. That would have been an alternate branch from the prime timeline. Thus the paths of the branches would never meet, only forever run parallel within their own universe, despite that Joe Russo has stated in interviews that Cap went back to the original timeline, which again contradicts how Dr. Banner describes time travel. I could go on, but you get the point. Right now I can see some people saying, well, how could the past not have stones at all? If they don't have the stones then, wouldn't that lead to an imbalance of power because they are so sought after by everyone within the timeline? Even taking one of the stones away would cause a nexus event, or destroying all the stones would create a nexus event within that timeline, causing the multiverse to start? Yes, the stones from different timelines should have created nexus events within them. However, once they have the stones they need, they leave that timeline so we don't ever see what happens because of it. And no, the idea of all the stones being destroyed at the same time wouldn't create a nexus event. Once Thanos destroyed all the stones, nothing happened to have any of the universes collide. It had been days when the remaining Avengers had found him and they were told that the stones were destroyed. And as we saw with the TVA, when a nexus event occurred, especially understanding the severity of what would have been caused in destroying the greatest power source of the universe at the time, they were swift to try to correct it. And there was no evidence of that happening from the moment that they were destroyed up to the Avengers going back in time. The timeline that we are in once they return from the past is depicted as to be the prime timeline, as it is understood as the events that are supposed to happen. However, as Dr. Banner stated how time travel works, traveling back in time creates a new timeline, which means that there are now 2 prime timelines in the same universe. From the time the Avengers return from the future, no TVA agents are present to assess this huge issue within the sacred timeline. Now let's go ahead and look at Disney's Loki and how the prime timeline no longer exists for its show for the Loki that we've known for the MCU. First thing to understand is the opening scene. When Loki is pleading his case, he is actually right about the Avengers being the actual ones to have him, the variant, go against the prime timeline, which affects the sacred timeline. Also, when it came to the Avengers going back in time, nobody from the past knew of them doing so, yet Loki was able to tell Ravonna Renslayer that he knew that they went back in time. Lastly, from what she tells him that all of the events that the Avengers did were supposed to occur, that means Loki was supposed to take the Tesseract. Since it happened when going back in time for Scott and Tony to take it, they had to then travel back further to get it. Loki actually wouldn't have been a variant. His actions are supposed to be canon to the continuation of the story. This means that the TVA pruned Loki to the void at the end of time for no reason, making their own actions go against the thought of how the sacred timeline was supposed to be written. When Loki and Sylvie finally meet up with Kang the Conqueror, and he tells them everything that they had done was written to be as it was, that further proves that Loki actually isn't a variant. And that goes against everything that followed the events of him going back to Asgard in Avengers 2012, meaning every single other movie and show following that movie for the MCU isn't a part of the prime or sacred timeline. Yet no TVA agents went and reset it as per the rules of the TVA. So everything we know of the MCU following Avengers 2012 is a lie. Another huge issue with Loki is that it both supports and discredits the idea of branch timelines. But there is actually one definitive answer. And again, it proves that Endgame never occurred. Throughout the series, they describe the idea of a sacred timeline and multi-universe theory, but how they support each idea contradicts one another constantly. There are 2 ways to be able to think of this that can make any sense at all. First is that the prime timeline, meaning everything we have been shown from Iron Man to Endgame, exists within one universe, including the branches of time. This is supported when Captain America goes back in time and runs into himself. The difference between the 2 are age and everything that comes with it, meaning that each branch from the prime timeline starts identically as the prime timeline does. Everything that is actively occurring in the moment it branches is consistent. But what can change is, for example, if Black Widow was as she is in the prime timeline, she would be the exact same in the branch, with only the events following the branch having different results, being consistent with Dr. Banner saying that the past can't be changed, but the future could for the alternate timeline off of the prime timeline. This is also supported by the sight of several different looking Lokis when pruned into the void at the end of time. Yes, Loki can shapeshift. However, each one starts at a base form, and to shapeshift, they would have to be using power to do so. And just like with doing any activity, eventually you need to relax and to not use power, thus going back into your base form. Also, Mobius tells Loki in episode 2 how the reset charges are supposed to only change back the events that led to the Nexus event, meaning if a reset charge was placed in New York and only was currently affecting New York at the time, they would then reset New York. It would have no effect elsewhere. These points help prove the idea that the branches from the prime timeline are not different universes, but are different realities from the prime timeline, hence why Doctor Strange was able to view 14,605 different outcomes. However, this doesn't mean that those are different branches, just the odds of one outcome based off the actions taken that are needed for said outcome. The second idea is where they start proving everything from traveling back in time to get the Infinity Stones didn't occur, even going as far back as Avengers 2012 as well. Sylvie stated in episode 4 that after being captured, her world was erased, meaning that when a branch was created from a Nexus event, that it needed to be destroyed, thus only having a prime timeline, making any timeline be a universe. If too many universes were to conflict with one another, then that could open up a rift in space and time, possibly unleashing every variation of Thanos, for example, into the same time, and it is their job to keep that from occurring. This idea is supported several times in the season, the first being episode 2 when Miss Minutes gives Loki a rundown of how the sacred timeline works after he was captured, showing how the branches of the sacred timeline are destroyed and the sacred timeline is back to how it was supposed to occur. Another is from episode 5, explaining how realities of time are dropped into the void at the end of time for Alioth to destroy, meaning once a reset charge is activated, the reality is sent to the void. In episode 6, Ravonna tells Mobius once he returns from the void that if timelines weren't pruned, then chaos would ensue, meaning that branches from the timeline needed to be erased to not be able to further continue on, not just specific sections of them from a specific moment in time. A much larger hint to this is when Mobius in episode 2 confirms the butterfly effect, when he and Loki go into an apocalyptic event and Loki causes changes within the timeline before the volcano destroys everything. And Mobius sees that regardless of Loki's actions, nothing changes as those townspeople and everything around them were doomed, whether it be by the volcano or Loki moments before the volcano erupts. Something important to consider is if things were erased when reset, that would mean that, for example, 2012 Captain America would have been killed when the TVA reset the timeline in Loki's first episode. With that occurring, Endgame never happened. Also when Quill went looking for 2014 Gamora, she would have been killed along with the 2014 timeline. However, Zoe Saldana has signed off to continue playing 2014 Gamora in the future, as we know 2023 Gamora is dead. With those points alone, that would then discredit everything that has happened preceding the Avengers returning to the future with the Infinity Stones, as creating branch realities would create a new universe, meaning the TVA should have been present to reset the timeline and take all the Avengers to the TVA, as they would act against the ideals of the sacred timeline. Meaning even if they wouldn't be apprehended before going back to the future, they should have been once they all got back, meaning that the blip never was reversed and Thanos did actually win. Looking closer at the theory where each one of the Loki variants at the void at the end of time come from different universes, that then supports the idea that every single universe in the sacred timeline has to abide by the exact same rules when it comes to pruning. So for example, you can't have one universe, when a nexus event has occurred, have just part of that new timeline reset, as Mobius told Loki in episode 2, whereas in another universe, once there's a nexus event and the variant is captured, that the entire new timeline has to be erased, as will happen to Sylvie in her timeline. You have to have consistency for all universes being affected in the sacred timeline. Otherwise, you would have nothing to support the idea that any of the universes would be able to interact with one another in the same way, meaning that there could be no potential multiversal war for the fact that none of them go by the same rules. To even argue the point that, well, at least we did see that the Avengers actually won against Thanos in that particular timeline, if you were to go back to the original timeline, as when Doctor Strange sees that only 14,605 outcomes, that the one outcome we saw was the one that they won, chances are the prime timeline didn't have as good of luck. So, I'm sorry Disney, but it turns out you're the variant, and you need to pay for your crimes.
Please rise. Court is now in session.
Mickey Mouse, you are here because you have committed crimes against the sacred fan base as well as general audiences worldwide. How do you plead?
On behalf of Marvel, I have to say that we are only guilty of wanting more money.
Oh really? That's all you're guilty of?
Yes, Your Honor. We are only acting under interests as been displayed since our monopolistic takeover of movie studios, because we know that the majority of our audience comes from the general public, not the actual fans of Marvel, like comic book nerds.
Oh wow. So how would that work in the grander scheme of things? Alienating people as far as a marketing tactic to be able to get more money.
The way you say it makes it sound like we were doing something wrong. You see, the general audience, they don't care about the details. They don't care about the facts of space and time or any mumbo jumbo like that. They see one of our superhero movies and they just want to see heroes heroing. So we give them tons of superheroes, played by attractive men, beautiful women, wearing sexy outfits as additional plot armor for possible lack of powers or immunity to constant death. What? Is there a problem? Did you not take the check, actually several checks, from contracts you willingly signed to play a character you knew before stepping on set would be portrayed as she was, getting specific angles, and again, you took the checks to wait over 10 years later to say you didn't want to be portrayed that way? Holy... Anyway, as long as we give the general audience a good movie, who cares about the details? Actual fans or people like you that can expose our plot holes and inconsistencies are what? Less than 10% of our revenue? When we make billions exploiting these heroes and retroing them whenever we need them, do you think missing out on your money will make any difference compared to if we didn't pander to the general audience? We make the rules, and we will continue to both take people's money and break our rules when it fits the narrative.
That sounds like how some people would describe a marriage, where you have one spouse that is trying to drain the life force while simultaneously gaining a leverage and trapping the breadwinner.
Yeah, but when people become fans, that's them signing our contract. And we will break the rules and still take their money, because we aren't going anywhere willingly.
God. Have you been hanging out with that new viral gold digger who still has her ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago paying all of her bills now, while she currently has a new boyfriend that is living in the house that the previous 2-year-ago boyfriend is still paying for and is being a freeloader? Is that the woman that you've pretty much been hanging out with to learn this kind of tactic?
Yeah, She's actually my financial advisor and my new main squeeze. Anyway, but especially because we will continue to pander to the children, and they love us. We are never going away. We will always be in your lives, no matter how bad we become. Nobody can stop us! Now, if you'll excuse me, before we start working on White Panther, welcome to Wakanda. There's nothing like taking beloved, classic characters and gender and race swapping them for a narrative that's pushed upon the audience to just accept because I have to get back to the clubhouse. I have a date.
This isn't over, Mickey. Your reign of terror is going to end. This is not going to be able to continue forever.
I can't hear you over the shitload of money y'all continue to be making from this. Bye-bye.